Good morning and welcome in. My name is Andy Miller, and I have the privilege of serving every day as the executive director of Our Just Future. We're a Portland area organization that pushes back on the forces causing poverty and homelessness in our community. And I'm with you this morning to provide a brief session that will hopefully give an overview of our local response to homelessness over the last, 50 or so years. In the housing world, you can see the overlapping ways our organization partners with people and community to respond to both the causes and the impacts of homelessness and poverty. We're geographically focused on East Portland and East Multnomah County, but many of our services are available countywide. On a personal level, I've been working on these issues for over 30 years, beginning my career as an attorney, working on eviction and fair housing cases. But I've also worked as a government planner and program developer, and most recently in the nonprofit sector for a recovery-oriented organization, and now here at Our Just Future. Uh, the issue of homelessness, as we all know, is complex, and the solutions we are needing are large, systemic, and not simple. But the one simple truth that gets me up every morning is that in our region and hundreds of places like it, there are really good people working tirelessly on all fronts toward a truly more just future, one in which homelessness becomes a thing of the past. May we all get there together. In this session, as I mentioned, we will provide a brief history of our homeless response since the 1970s. I'm sure I'll miss a few things for those of you who are historians. I'm not a researcher or a historian, just a witness. But for those of you who are, please feel free to use the contact information for me provided in the conference materials and reach out. I'd love to continue the discussion and hear more about some things I missed or maybe got wrong. My theme today is really to ask the question, what does our history say about where we need to head? We've all seen this quote, and so it is important that we look back, not to point fingers or place blame, but to learn and do better. So let's start this story in the 1970s, where two relevant features of life in Portland for the purpose of this conversation come to prominence. The first is a far more friendly housing market than we see today anywhere on the West Coast, and a growth boom of infrastructure and redevelopment. Portland was about to get bigger, more complex, and more dense. Um, at the time of the 1970s, the major concern in downtown Portland was not homelessness per se, but for the purpose of this conversation, it was public inebriation. The reason for that, why people weren't talking so much about homelessness, but about the specific behaviors they saw on the streets, is that folks had a place to go. Portland was one of the lowest cost housing markets in the United States. And at that time, downtown still had many of the historic hotels and flop houses where folks or the social workers that were supporting folks who might otherwise be outside could find rooms for rent at $25 per week or less. Um, Portland was also seeing development and redevelopment of its historic neighborhoods, both downtown and on the east side. I mentioned here the Emmanuel Hospital urban renewal area, where the redevelopment that was planned for the expansion of the hospital forced the displacement of over 150 families, most of whom were Black, and also the loss of Black businesses in the name of neighborhood improvement. I mention this because we cannot speak about our housing crisis without locating its roots in institutional and systemic racism. And we saw the continuation of that through this urban renewal process through which many families lost their homes. As we move into the 1980s, the area sees the passage of a somewhat obscure but also very important government resolution known as Resolution A. Resolution A was an effort to divide responsibilities between these geographically overlapped jurisdictions, the city of Portland and the surrounding Multnomah County. Through Resolution A, for the purpose of this discussion, we can note that the city of Portland took over responsibility for infrastructure, public safety, and neighborhood livability, and the county became the primary jurisdiction responsible for the delivery of human services. This division becomes pretty defining and important in the homeless realm because as the homeless delivery system was starting to get bigger, the problem was growing. Um, we evolved locally 4 systems of care: the single adult system, the homeless family system, and then 2 separate systems for supporting youth who are experiencing homelessness and survivors of domestic violence. Only the first population that I mentioned, the system to serve unaccompanied single adults experiencing homelessness, stays with the city. The other 3 systems fall in with the county. And the reason I mention this is I think it defines some roles that those 2 jurisdictions are still playing today. The city of Portland is trying to respond to homelessness, in part at least, as a public safety and livability issue, while the county continues its primary role as the provider of human services, even as the distinctions begin to blur over the next several decades between the 2 jurisdictions. The other thing that we see in the 1980s was what I think was Portland's first plan to end homelessness, and that was Mayor Bud Clark's 12-point plan. And one of the most important features of it that's worth calling out is it set a goal of ending homelessness by providing universal housing for everyone who needs it. And I wonder if 40 years later, our plans are still echoing that kind of goal and pointing toward that kind of North Star. Um, 2 other developments in the 80s worth noting for today. It was the coming together of Hayden, the homeless alcohol and drug intervention network. This was an innovative partnership between treatment providers that also included a strong housing component, the beginning of a real structured system to provide recovery housing. And in 1988, the organization that I work for, now known as Our Just Future, was founded under its former name, Human Solutions, as part of the move to bring community action services into the community from behind county walls. As we move into the 90s, we again see some of the antecedents of today's discussions. So on the one hand, the city of Portland was moving to reconfigure the shelter and response system for single homeless adults in the wake of a high-profile event. Long-term shelter, the Recovery Inn, known locally as Bologna Joe's, was closing. And in response, the city began to adopt a continuum approach to homelessness. In the continuum approach, people move gradually from the streets to shelters, from shelters to transitional housing, and then finally, after a period of time, receiving services into permanent housing. This was an approach that was popular at the time and known as housing readiness. Shelters were reconfigured from large warehouses into smaller, more programmatic focused models to provide more services and help people achieve this housing readiness over time. Um, the challenge of the housing readiness system was that not everyone could climb the ladder quickly and make it into housing. Many people fell back, and it was often reported that if you fell out at any one rung of that ladder, you had to go back and start at the beginning. At the same time, another model began to take shape. Organizations began using rental assistance more aggressively and began to move people directly from shelters and even directly from the streets right into permanent housing using an approach we would now call a national best practice known as Housing First. Join a local nonprofit that helps connect people from streets to a home, was founded in 1992 as an effort to meet the housing needs of houseless adults who were dining at a community dining hall known as the St. Francis. Those folks were telling their caseworkers at the St. Francis that shelters were not a good option for them. They were noisy, rule driven, they felt unsafe. So organizations like Join and Northwest Pilot Project, that was responding to the Bologna Joe's closure, began using rental assistance effectively to move people into permanent housing, where they modeled this modern approach that we call supportive housing and housing first. Through the 1990s, downtown Portland saw the loss of many of the affordable downtown hotels and rooming houses that we were mentioning when we were talking about the 1970s. That meant the loss of kind of this backbone housing stock of last resort on which social service providers could rely to provide quick housing solutions for folks who needed housing right off the streets. Um, we saw a really rapidly changing housing market in Portland through the 1990s. We started the decade as one of the lowest cost housing markets in the country, certainly on the West Coast. But around 1997, we crossed the Delta. And for housing policy people, what that means is that that was the point in time when a median income family could no longer afford a median priced home. And over the last 30 years, that trend has gotten worse and worse. And today, homeownership is simply out of reach for many Portlanders, especially Black and Brown families. As we move into the 2000s, we begin to see some government officials and elected leaders begin to apply more urgency to the response to homelessness and to this looming issue of a housing crisis that people working on the front lines were calling out during the 1990s. We begin the decade of the 2000s with the city passage of the no net loss policy. This was a pretty radical effort to stem the tide of lost housing in downtown by intervening where we could to purchase and repurpose the hotels that were going to market, to repurpose them into permanent housing, and by measuring and monitoring the overall loss of housing in downtown. It was a wonderful policy, a strong effort brought forward by advocates. The challenge was providing the teeth. We simply couldn't keep up with the market and the forces of the market, and our replacement and preservation efforts could never match the scale of the housing that we were losing. Um, the loss of hundreds of last chance housing units really accelerated homelessness in downtown during this decade. Um, we also saw a follow-up to the Bud Clark plan. We saw a new plan called Home Again that leveraged research out of the University of Pennsylvania by Dennis Culhane about how communities can invest more strategically to end homelessness, and more on that in a moment. We also saw a new focus on affordable housing and the passage of the TIF set aside, which stands for the Tax Increment Finance Set Aside. This was a historic policy piece that committed urban renewal funding directly to affordable housing. So as the city was undertaking the redevelopment of neighborhood districts, TIF districts around the city, they were pledging various percentages of the money available for redevelopment to be available to develop affordable housing in those districts. It was an effort to stem the tide of displacement that gentrification and redevelopment were bringing. It was moderately successful at producing the housing, but many, many people still lost their homes and lost their ability to live in those neighborhoods. This was also a decade when we saw the city first sanction and invest in structured camps like Dignity Village and Right to Dream. These were unusual relationships for the city to undertake, but they began to provide some basic infrastructure and some access to land for self-organized and self-governing people experiencing homelessness who wanted the right to live in a self-governing community since there was no housing for them to move into. At the same time, we saw the city pick up a national trend and begin to try to pass ordinances to regulate camping in a way through a lens of regulating sidewalk traffic and panhandling. Most of those efforts were met with court challenges, and very few of those laws remain on the books. This was also the decade that HUD began mandating communities to begin its point in time counts, beginning to develop some of the data and metrics we still use today around homelessness. And at the end of the decade, we saw the city strengthen its commitment to affordable housing by consolidating housing functions within the city into a new bureau known as the Portland Housing Bureau. Just to drill down for a very quick second on Home Again, this plan that we passed in 2004, this was a step forward from the Bud Clark plan, and it leveraged this research that essentially said for communities to be successful, they need to refocus how they are using their resources, focus them on the relatively small percentage-wise population that's experiencing homelessness, and that's the 10% of folks on the street who are chronically homeless, and to begin to invest heavily in an approach that would move those folks quickly and permanently into housing. This is the housing first approach, kind of first ensconced in policy. It also had a strong prevention track by trying to keep larger systems that are ancillary to the housing system from discharging people into homelessness. And it really also firmed up our commitment to use this new approach of permanent supportive housing and brought the affordable housing system into focus on homelessness by setting a goal for it to produce new units of permanent supportive housing, 2,200 over the next 10 years. Um, The decade that followed was another decade of reorganization and some changes to the system that was charged with uh, delivering critical components of the homeless system. Um, Two new pieces were formed. The Joint Office of Homeless Services consolidated funding and oversight of all homeless systems within Multnomah County through an intergovernmental agreement with the City of Portland. The city would continue to focus on its primary role back from Resolution A as the overseer of public safety and livability. And we would see the city and county somewhat at odds as they played these two different roles with respect to homelessness. Um, the other thing that happened in the early part of this decade was a new homeless plan, a home for everyone. And this plan was a bit of a departure from Home Again in that it created an important policy shift from prioritizing the chronically homeless, that was the priority population under Home Again, to a broader set of priorities of vulnerable populations. It importantly focused a call out that had been missing to promote racial equity and justice in our work to end homelessness. Um, and it continued the commitment that was in Home Again to housing first and permanent solutions, but there was less clarity about the role of shelter and other system components in Home Again that continued to receive the largest portions of public funding. It also focused heavily on community engagement and in ensuring that people experiencing homelessness were at the table when solutions were discussed. Toward the end of the decade, the Ninth Circuit case, Martin versus Boise, which I believe will be a subject of another conference session, came down, and this court decision put constraints on cities like Portland looking to regulate camping, and it indirectly, therefore, incentivized an expansion of shelter beds to meet the threshold the court required for cities wanting to regulate public camping. It didn't do this directly, but it indirectly kind of pitted this desire to develop and focus on short-term solutions, get everybody into shelter, develop and operate more shelter beds versus the housing-based solutions we see emphasized in the research and in the previous plans. And we would see those two um, desirable and necessary pieces of the continuum compete for public funding in budgets since this case came down. The decade ended with an influx of important new resources to build affordable housing at a new scale and to fund needed services. Challenge here is we had historic levels of resource to develop affordable housing to deliver the companion services, but we didn't have in place at that time a consensus shared plan that was large enough and high profile enough to ensure that the spending of these resources would be uh, coordinated in a way that was needed to produce the stock of supportive housing and housing first that the homeless crisis was beginning to require as a good public response. In the end, these resources were planned for not under a unified planning body, but in planning bodies that were specific to each of the resources. So as a structural matter, it made coordination very difficult. As we move into the recent years, sort of the end of our history, we see a few things in the since 2020. One was the community and the homeless system had to respond to COVID. I would note that the COVID response here was very strong. Locally within the homeless sector, it shifted to a harm reduction model of supporting people in place, trying to keep everybody healthy. The city of Portland suspended its sweeping of homeless camps, and the shelter system moved to spread people out and moved away from congregate shelters. We got a lot of good results here. We didn't see the outbreaks that some other mass shelter communities did. Um, on a statewide level, Oregon as a whole really came to grips that homelessness and housing was not just a crisis of the Portland area, but one that was statewide. We saw the passage of new rent controls and some efforts to go above and beyond what we had been doing to support people's ability to pay their rent. So prevention became a very critical component of the COVID response. The Joint Office of Homeless Services, that was now about 10 years old, was growing rapidly to respond to this larger and larger crisis. And in recent years, it's experienced what I would call some growing pains, public and political scrutiny, that progress has not been happening fast enough, and that a long-term vision and a plan for the system um, wasn't in place, leaving a political vacuum. And I think today we start to see the political vacuum of not living under a comprehensive shared plan and theory of change being filled one new initiative at a time as policymakers try to demonstrate urgency but don't have a comprehensive plan under which to direct resources. One initiative I think that's happened recently sees the city back in its traditional role that I mentioned in the discussion of Resolution A, treating homelessness not as a housing issue, but as a livability issue for the larger population, and trying to live within the confines of Martin v. Boise. The city of Portland this past summer passed a ban on daytime camping, and coupled that with a large investment not in housing but in large structured campsites, as an effort to try to reorganize and redefine where people can sleep legally within the city of Portland. Makes you wonder a little bit where that effort and plan and North Star goal of providing housing to everyone that needs it has gone in our planning efforts. I think we're losing a little bit of sight of the North Star. So where does this all leave us? Two quick quotes, one from Benjamin Franklin. And I would say to this one, I don't think we have lacked plans. I showed you three that we've passed to respond to homelessness. But I think we've moved a little bit away from these large comprehensive plans and in specifically, as I mentioned, plans to end homelessness. And now we are seeing more short-term efforts to budget for and through a policy lens to manage for the impacts of homelessness, focusing heavily on the short term, losing a little bit of touch with that long term North Star. The second quote, I think, really describes what we need. It comes from Jeff Olivet. He's the executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and I use this quote a lot. Um, and I won't read it, but I'll just summarize. He talks about we've created homelessness on a systemic level, um, yet we try to solve it on the individual level. And the truth is, we've gotten very good at that. My organization and many others working in this space sees wonderful outcomes on a daily basis for the individual people that we're able to work with. What we haven't started to do is to take a systems approach to homelessness. This history sort of shows several efforts to reorganize the system, several efforts to pass new funding for housing and services, but it feels hard to see within all that history and where we are today, where we've had a moment to actually build or really change the systems that are producing homelessness. So, from COVID to public frustration, we're responding to what's right in front of us in ways that we can understand. I think the call right now is to think about how do we really get back to that North Star and plan for a systemic approach through all these resources to ensure that everyone who needs one has a place to call home. I'm going to wrap it up there. I just note that if you want to learn more about my organization, you can hold your phone up to the screen and that'll take you to our website. And I hope you learn more about us. I look forward to hearing from you, perhaps seeing you in the larger panel discussions. And I hope you have a great day and enjoy the conference.